Hello everyone at CVPR. I'm Racheal Jack from the University of Glasgow, and today I'm going to be talking about how we can now move beyond traditional boundaries in understanding facial expressions of emotion, and how this presents some challenges and opportunities to inferring emotions from images and videos. Before I begin, a very special thanks to Alice Martinez for inviting me to this really exciting symposium. All right, so to introduce myself, I'm a psychologist and my research focuses on understanding how humans perceive facial expressions, including across cultures. This enables us to better understand how facial expressions serve complex social interactions, and I also use this knowledge to inform the design of digital agents so that they can generate nuanced and recognizable facial expressions. And as I'll point out today, it can also be used to inform approaches to the detection of facial expressions of emotions. Now, to best serve that goal of using psychological science to inform emerging technological challenges, I'd like to share with you three main points. The first is that facial expressions are not universal. It's a very commonly held assumption, but it is in fact not true. It never has been true, and I'll show you some data on that soon. The second is that knowledge of facial expressions is currently quite limited, which is in part due to the use of traditional theory-driven approaches. In turn, these two limitations have restricted some of the developments in the accurate detection of facial expressions, and of course the ability of psychology and psychologists, such as myself, to play a leading role in their design. Now, to alleviate these constraints, I'll show you today how using data-driven methods, such as those we've developed in Glasgow, can expand knowledge of facial expressions beyond these traditional boundaries to understand cultural differences and similarities, and to broaden and deepen knowledge beyond 6 static facial expressions, which in turn will enable new technologies to reach their potential and enable psychology to play a more active role in their development. So let's start with the common understanding that facial expressions are universal. So in developing technologies that can automatically detect or generate facial expressions of emotion, many have turned to the field of psychology to understand which specific face movements, such as smiling, frowning, or eye widening, correspond to different emotions, with a view of then detecting these movements in the wild. And in doing so, one will very quickly come across one of the most influential and well-known findings, that 6 specific facial expressions, shown here, universally represent 6 basic and distinct emotions: happy, surprise, fear, disgust, anger, and sad. Now, for some brief background, this work, pioneered by Ekman and based on Darwin's work, they took photographs of facial expressions very similar to these ones, and showed them to people in many countries across the world, including Japan, the US, UK, Papua New Guinea, and China, and asked them to classify these images by emotion, often using an alternative forced choice task. It's also worth pointing out here that they used recognition or perception to understand facial expression production, because they reasoned that if these facial expressions were recognized in a given culture, then they are likely to be produced in that culture. Now, Darwin, as an evolutionary biologist, was one of the first to note this very intimate link between production and perception, stating that one of the leading principles which have determined the chief movements of expression is the recognition of expression. Okay, so in addition to Ekman's work and the many, many studies that followed, it was consistently reported that these 6 facial expressions are recognized across all cultures. These then quickly became the gold standard in psychological research. In fact, the story goes that you couldn't publish without them. And in other fields, of course, such as affective computing and social robotics more recently. Consequently, many automatic facial expression detection and generation technologies are based on these 6 universal facial expressions. However, there are several critical issues that limit their use in these applications, such as detecting facial expressions in the wild. So the first, as hinted at earlier, is that these facial expressions are not universally recognized across cultures, at least not in the way that we might expect. In fact, extensive cross-cultural recognition studies, including Ekman's, have consistently shown that they elicit considerable variance in recognition accuracy across cultures. So to illustrate here is a map showing the results of several key studies, including Ekman's seminal 1969 science paper, where each point represents the average recognition accuracy of each of the 6 emotions in that geographical region. Pinks and purples indicate high accuracy, blues and greens indicate lower accuracy. Those outlined in black are those below 75%, which would be considered overall typical recognition performance using clinical references. So as you can see, recognition accuracy is generally higher in Western countries than it is in East Asian countries, with some levels falling quite low. And this is particularly true for fear, disgust, and anger. Now you might be thinking, if there are cultural differences, why are they reported as universally recognized? And the answer is quite simple. Most of the studies use above chance performance, which in a 6 alternative forced choice task is about 17%. So in using this rather liberal threshold, any substantial cultural differences were masked. Okay, so these very robust results suggest that instead of being universal, these particular facial expressions represent those used in Western culture. Okay, so that is the first key point that I'd like to make today, that the 6 basic facial expressions are not universal, or not at least in the way that most of us would understand it. Now, these results raise a couple of questions and observations about our understanding of facial expressions. The first is that it's not entirely surprising that these facial expressions are, generally speaking, more Western than universal, when we consider the method that was used to create them. That is, they were hand-selected in a top-down manner by 3 Western experimenters based on their own intuitions and observations. So essentially, the experimenters created images that they thought looked happy, sad, disgusted, and so on. And this is a really critical methodological point that we'll turn to next. The second is that if these facial expressions do not accurately represent these emotions outside of Western culture, then which ones do? Okay, so this brings us to the next key point that I'd like to make today, which is that knowledge of facial expressions currently is quite limited, due in part to methodological limitations. And the good news, as I'll show you today, is that new technical and methodological advancements now overcome these limitations and enable us to broaden and deepen our understanding of facial expressions. Okay, so I've given you one example of how our knowledge of facial expressions is currently limited, that we have good representations of Western facial expressions, but less so of other cultures. But there are also many other areas where knowledge needs to be built. For example, the vast majority of research has focused on emotions. More specifically, it is focused on a small subset of only 6 emotions, when of course a much wider range of nuanced emotions exist. Then of course within that, as shown earlier, only a small and specific set of facial expressions have been tested. That is the 6 standardized images you saw earlier, which represent a very small proportion of the facial expressions the human face can make. We know that they were selected in a top-down manner by experimenters. And finally, they are static, and so they don't have any of the potentially important dynamic information, such as the temporal sequencing of the face movements, their intensity, and so on. So together, these various methodological choices or research directions, if you like, have limited our knowledge of facial expressions. So why is that? And the answer, of course, is again very simple. It's because facial expressions are incredibly complex. And this is summed up really nicely by Labar in relation to cultural variance, who said that in the language of gesture all over the world, there are varying mixtures of the physiologically conditioned response and the purely cultural one. and it is frequently difficult to analyse out and segregate the two. And this is as true now as it was then in 1947. So now let's take a closer look at this complexity of facial expressions. So as most of you are aware, the human face is comprised of many different muscles that can each be activated independently at different intensities, speeds, and so on, and combined in many different ways to create a very high number of complex dynamic patterns, which we call facial expressions. This complexity is, of course, a great design feature because it means that the human face can transmit a very wide range of nuanced social messages, including emotions, mental states, and behavioural intentions. And given their central importance in human social interactions, understanding facial expressions as a tool for social communication in terms of their grammar, their syntax, and meaning has been a focus in psychology, anthropology, and philosophy for well over a century, and now more recently, of course, in computer science and social robotics. But as just illustrated, identifying amongst all of these complex variations which facial expressions convey which messages and to whom is empirically very challenging, because the face is a high-dimensional dynamic information space comprising many individual face movements, which are called action units, each with a set of dynamic parameters. So how do we tackle then this complex task of finding, and amongst all of these various combinations, which ones transmit meaningful social messages? So one approach which I'll show you today is to use the same classic method as traditional research of showing facial expressions to people and asking them to categorize them, but with a psychophysical twist. So let me show you how this works. Okay, so imagine that you see this person. You might think that they are perhaps disgusted or angry. Now, what about this person? Well, it's not really clear, at least not to me. Okay, so the psychophysical twist here is that they have been randomly generated. That is, they have not been hand selected, neither of these facial expressions. So this means that the random facial expression on the left just happens to correspond to something that you already know. For example, disgust, whereas the one on the right doesn't correspond to anything that you know. So using this bottom-up approach of using the perception of individuals, as we have just done, we can identify the face movement patterns that convey meaningful emotion messages to individuals within any culture. Okay, so how then did we generate these facial expressions? So we use a dynamic face movement generator developed by you and colleagues, which is comprised of a library of individual face movements called action units. Each action unit was captured from a real human, specially trained to move each one of these action units on their face independently, captured using a stereoscopic system. So we can also control the movement of each of these action units using 6 or more temporal parameters such as acceleration, amplitude, and peak latency. So by activating and combining different action units together, we can create almost any facial behavior. So during the experiment, we randomly sample a subset of face movements and we assign a random movement to each, represented here with these color-coded curves. They are then combined to create a random face movement. The participant then categorizes it according to the 6 classic emotions. For example, if and only if the face movement pattern corresponds to their prior knowledge. Otherwise, they select other. And this means that on each trial, we can capture the specific dynamic action unit patterns that convey these emotions to that person. Then, after many such trials, we can build a statistical relationship between the dynamic action unit patterns presented on each trial and the participants' responses to produce a mathematical model of each facial expression. Importantly, this means that we have a precise quantitative representation of each facial expression that we can then formally analyze and compare, for example, across cultures. We also compute models for each individual observer to estimate population variance and to demonstrate replication of results across n participants. Specifically, each facial expression model is represented as a binary vector that details the action units that are significantly associated with the perception of the emotion. Each action unit also has corresponding values that represents their movement. This means that we can identify similarities and differences across, for example, different emotion categories. For example, you can see here that surprise and fear share the eye whites, with a little bit of this in anger too. However, surprise and fear differ on brow lowrer. This action unit is shared between fear and sad most often. In contrast, the lip corner puller is almost exclusively associated with happy. So by using a data-driven perception-based psychophysical method to derive quantitative representations of facial expressions, we can specifically identify what face movements transmit what emotions to whom, and to start to crack the code of facial expression communication. Okay, so having covered the second point, I'm now going to show you some examples from our lab where we have used data-driven psychological method to advance understanding of facial expressions beyond their traditional boundaries. So we've done so in several areas, including emotions, a broader range of social messages, including pain, personality traits, and different smiles, and in fundamental signaling such as valence and arousal and superstimuli. We've then used these together to build a formal generative model of social face communication. So today, because we're talking about emotions, I'll focus on 4 main emotion results, primarily relating to cultural differences and to temporal dynamics. And before I begin, I should reiterate that these results relate to the perception of facial expressions, whereas many of you might be most interested in the production of facial expressions. So I present these results with in mind the intrinsic link between production and perception, as highlighted earlier, the specifics of which continue to be explored and understood in detail. For example, what is used for perception by the receiver is likely to be a subset of the information that is produced by the expressor. Okay, so let's start with the cultural variance in the 6 basic emotions. Okay, so this video is playing on a loop and it's going to be showing happy, disgust, and anger, with the East Asian facial expression models on the left and the Western models on the right. So let's first start with the East Asians on the left. Here you're going to see that the eye movement varies across these different emotions. So let's start with happy, disgust, anger. So do you see how the eyes are different between these 3 emotions? Let's go again. Happy, disgust, anger. So it's very easy to distinguish between these 3 emotions just from looking at the eyes. Now let's switch to the Westerners on the left. Happy, disgust, anger. So you can see that you can't really tell the difference between, for example, say, disgust and anger just from looking at the eyes, because there's just not enough variance. So let's have a look again. Happy, disgust, and anger. Disgust and anger eyes are very, very similar here. Now, if we switch to the mouth, we find the opposite pattern. So let's start with the East Asians again, which are on the left. Happy, disgust, anger. So here you can't really tell the difference between disgust and anger, and even the asymmetry is the same. Let's look again. Happy, disgust, anger. Very, very similar. Now let's move to the right-hand side to the Westerners. Happy, disgust, anger. So here you can distinguish them because the mouth movements are different. Happy, disgust, anger. You can see that there's enough variance there to be able to tell the difference. So here, these data are here to illustrate that we can precisely identify the specific differences in the face movements across cultures. Okay, so now let's turn to some cultural commonalities, because of course we're interested in both. So here we modeled the facial expressions of over 60 different emotions into cultures. So that's about a 10-fold increase from the classic 6 emotions. Now remember that each facial expression is represented as a binary vector. We then applied a data reduction technique to these models to identify any latent expressive patterns that underlie and structure this wide range of facial expressions. And the results showed that 4, not 6, culturally common latent expressive patterns, each of which are associated with emotions with a specific valence or arousal. For example, the leftmost expressive pattern primarily subtends positive emotions such as happy, pride, and delighted, whereas the rightmost pattern primarily subtends negative high arousal emotions such as disgust, rage, and hate. Therefore, each of the 60 individual facial expressions of emotion can be expressed as a weighted combination of these latent expressive patterns. For example, ecstatic primarily comprises the wide eyes and mouth expressive pattern plus a distinct accent from the smiling pattern. So here we found that 4 culturally common latent expressive patterns, each associated with valence and arousal, combine in an algebraic way to generate complex facial expressions. Okay, so now let's turn to dynamics. So facial expressions are dynamic, with different face movements activated over time to convey information. Now, given that our facial expression models are dynamic, we can examine sequences of face movements over time and what information they convey. So using a combination of information theory and Bayesian classifiers and over 700 facial expression models of the 6 classic emotions, we found that their face movements follow a specific temporal sequence where shared action units, such as the eye whites in fear and surprise, are activated early, causing confusions between these emotions, followed later by action units that distinguish these emotions. Here, brow raiser in surprise and lip stretcher in fear. We also found this pattern for disgust and anger. The nose wrinkler, which is shared, appears early, followed by upper lip raiser for disgust and the eye whites later for anger. Therefore, disgust and anger, which are both also considered basic emotions, are also confused early in the signaling dynamics and are not distinguished until later. So in keeping with dynamics, let's now turn to a recent study examining how emotion category information and emotion intensity information is transmitted over time. So using our psychophysical and information theoretic approach, we identified the action units that perceivers use to classify the facial expressions as one of the 6 classic emotions, those that are used to perceive emotional intensity, and those that serve a dual role of classification and intensification, each represented here with a Venn diagram. So that is the functions of emotion classification, intensification, or a dual role of classification and intensification. We then examined the temporal sequencing of these action unit types in each of the 6 classic emotions and found a clear temporal distinction between classifier and intensifier action units. So let me now just show you a couple of examples. Okay, so this is a slow-mo video of happy. First, you'll see the eye whites, for which this emotion is an intensifier. This will be followed by the smiling mouth, which for this emotion serves as a classifier. Okay, let's have a look. So eye whites and then smiling. So the eye whites are the intensifier, the mouth is the classifier. So eye whites first and then the classifier, smiling motion. Now let's turn to another example, which is anger. So here you'll see that the intensifiers come later. These are the wide open mouth and the eye whites. The emotion classifier, the nose wrinkler, comes early. So let's have a look. See the nose wrinkler followed by the wide open mouth and then the eye whites. Nose wrinkler, mouth, eyes. So here we've shown that face movements follow a specific temporal sequence, a syntax if you like, where emotion category information and emotion intensity information are temporally decoupled, presenting the observer with a cascade of socially relevant information over time. This approach can also enable us to understand the time point at which confusions might occur, for example, between different emotion categories or across cultures. Okay, so using these 4 studies as examples, I've shown you how we've developed and used data-driven psychophysical methods to objectively model the dynamic face movement patterns that communicate emotions, including the 6 classic and a wider range of nuanced emotions within and across cultures. And using results from our extended research program, we can now start to crack the code of facial expression communication in order to build a formal generative model of face signaling that can be used to inform psychological theories and potentially the design of effective computing technologies. For example, in terms of a generative capacity, we've enhanced the social signaling capabilities of digital agents by improving how accurately they can convey emotion messages to human users in different cultures, appear more human-like, and have a wider repertoire of signaling capabilities. Okay, so coming back then to our key points. The first is that facial expressions are not universal and are in fact culturally nuanced, which in turn can give rise to significant cultural confusions. The second is that knowledge of facial expressions is quite limited, in part due to the use of traditional theory-driven approaches. And third, these limitations have so far restricted the development of facial expression detection systems and the ability of psychology to play a leading role in their design. But as I've hopefully shown you today, we're now at this really exciting juncture where new technical and methodological developments enable knowledge to be expanded beyond traditional boundaries and to understand facial expressions in all their complexity, including what is cross-cultural and what is culture-specific. Okay, so finally, I'd like to leave you with some recent technical developments of the face movement platform, where several emotion-related features have been added, including different eye movements, where gaze direction is important for emotion communication, also blushing and pallor, which can indicate internal states. We also have head movements in all directions, such as head tilting with chin down, or nodding and so on. We also can create superstimuli, of course, and we've also recently developed mouth patterns to emulate speech. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for your attention. Also to all my collaborators and funders. If anybody has any questions or comments, please do feel free to contact me at this email address. Thank you.